She was black, she was calm, and she was being kicked out of first class, publicly, unapologetically, and without reason. No raised voice, no broken rule, just the wrong skin color in the wrong seat according to the wrong person. This isn't the story of someone losing her place. It's the story of someone taking it back and making everyone who doubted her regret it. On a flight where the uniform came with unchecked power and the passengers stayed silent, one woman was targeted, humiliated, and told she didn't belong. What they didn't know was that she wasn't just another passenger. They were about to find out exactly who she was. If you believe justice doesn't need a spotlight to make an impact, like this video, subscribe for more real power stories, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what part of this moment hit you hardest? Let's get into it. Good afternoon and welcome aboard, Lindsay Monroe said, her voice smooth as silk, but her eyes sharp as glass. She didn't smile, not really, not for them. She had already scanned the manifest when she spotted the couple walking toward the boarding gate, Harold and Ruth Simmons. Seat 1A and 1B, first class, confirmed. But something in her bristled the moment she saw them. Harold walked with a slight limp, a black cane tapping softly against the polished tile, his posture proud despite his age. He wore a soft gray blazer, wool slacks, and well-polished brown Oxfords. Ruth, elegant in a muted teal dress suit and low heels, walked beside him, her scarf tied neatly beneath her chin, one hand gently resting on her husband's arm. Their presence radiated quiet dignity, the kind cultivated over decades of life. But to Lindsay, they looked out of place. Not because of what they wore or how they walked, but because no matter how hard she tried to hide it, her instincts told her one thing: they didn't belong in first class. Not on her aircraft. "May I see your boarding passes?" she asked, her tone clipped just enough to feel unnatural. Ruth, unfazed, handed them over with a pleasant smile. "Of course," she said, her voice warm. Lindsay barely glanced at the screen, even though she'd already seen the seating chart twice before. No mistake, paid in full, but her lips tightened anyway. She held the passes a beat too long before handing them back. "Thank you," she said, then added without pause, "Please step aside for a moment while I verify something." Her hand gestured toward the side of the carpeted gate entrance, like she was ushering a child out of traffic. Harold raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" he asked, calm but firm. "Just standard protocol," Lindsay replied smoothly, not looking them in the eye. "We've had some last-minute seating conflicts. I'll sort it out quickly." She walked away before they could respond, her heels tapping with purpose, though the truth was there was nothing to sort out. She wasn't looking for answers. She was buying time. In the back of her mind, she justified it. Maybe they were upgraded by mistake. Maybe someone else with real status had been displaced. Either way, she didn't care to double-check. What she did care about was image, hers, the airlines, and the pristine appearance of first class. She tapped into the internal system, typed a quick note to the gate manager, and flagged the seats for a recheck of assignment authority. She added a side note: passengers appear confused about tier designation. A lie, of course, but one she told herself was harmless. When she returned, the couple was still waiting patiently near the velvet rope, standing tall despite the sideways glances from other passengers. Lindsay approached with a rehearsed expression of bureaucratic regret. "Unfortunately, there's been a seating conflict," she said, without blinking. "We may need to reassign you to the forward business cabin." Ruth's brow furrowed. "Business class?" she asked. "There must be a mistake. We reserved first-class seats months ago." Harold pulled out his phone and scrolled to the receipt. "Would you like to see the confirmation?" he offered. Lindsay didn't take the phone. "It's not about your payment," she said quickly. "It's about the tier you booked under. There's a distinction between cash upgrades and original status." She knew that sounded like gibberish, but she delivered it with just enough certainty to make most people second-guess themselves. "The system doesn't lie," she added. Ruth's face remained composed, but her lips pressed into a thin line. "We are not confused," she said quietly. "We've flown this route 3 times this year, always in the same seats." Lindsay gave a non-committal shrug. "These things happen. I'll need you to step aside until we resolve it." Before they could protest, Lindsay turned away and began pre-boarding the rest of the first-class passengers. A young white couple in matching travel cardigans breezed through with friendly smiles. A middle-aged hedge fund manager shook her hand like an old friend. Lindsay smiled back, offered them champagne menus, and thanked them for their loyalty. All the while, Harold and Ruth stood quietly to the side, watching people who had arrived after them take their seats. It wasn't long before a few curious eyes turned their way. One teenager in athletic gear whispered something to his mother, who shook her head. "They probably tried to sneak in," she muttered. Lindsay didn't correct her. She didn't say a word. Instead, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a small canister of citrus-scented deodorizer, and gave a short spritz in the air, subtle, but close enough to Harold's cane to make her point. "Just freshening things up," she said breezily, not making eye contact. Harold didn't flinch. Ruth blinked slowly, registering what just happened, but she said nothing. Not yet. By the time the last of the first-class passengers boarded, Lindsay circled back to the couple. "I'm afraid there's still a conflict," she said, "but I've arranged complimentary seats in Comfort Select. You'll still arrive at the same time," she added with a smirk. Harold looked down at his ticket. "This isn't about seating," he said slowly. "Is it?" Lindsay offered a cool smile. "Sir, I think we both know the answer to that." Once Harold and Ruth were seated not in first class where they belonged, but in row 4D and 4E, the final two seats in what Lindsay called the acceptable forward section, the next act began. She made sure to assign them seats directly across from the galley curtain, where flight attendants would shuffle in and out with carts and clatter, and where privacy was non-existent. From her vantage point behind the service station, Lindsay watched them settle in with calm, deliberate movements. Ruth unfolded the airline-provided blanket and adjusted the small pillow behind her husband's back. Harold didn't speak. He didn't complain. That irritated her more than if he had. They weren't fighting back. They were enduring. And she hated that. As the cabin filled, Lindsay made her rounds with a practiced smile. She offered champagne to passengers in first class with genuine warmth, sometimes calling them by name. To a woman in 1A, she knelt to compliment her shoes. To the man in 2B, she handed his sparkling water with 2 slices of lime, just as he liked it. But when she reached row 4, her entire demeanor shifted. She held the tray a little higher, forcing Ruth to crane her neck. "We have sparkling water or apple juice," she said flatly, skipping the champagne entirely. Ruth blinked. "No sparkling wine?" she asked gently. Lindsay's lips barely moved. "We're limiting certain options due to weight restrictions on this flight." That was a lie. A full cart of unopened bottles sat behind the curtain 10 feet away. Ruth nodded slowly, clearly understanding but choosing not to escalate. "Water is fine," she said. Harold didn't request anything. Lindsay placed the 2 small plastic cups on their tray tables with a dull clack and turned away without another word. 10 minutes later, the pre-flight snacks were offered to the other passengers. Lindsay walked down the aisle offering warm towels and small ceramic dishes filled with seasoned almonds and cheese crackers. But when she reached Harold and Ruth again, she carried only a paper napkin and a sealed pack of pretzels. "Sorry," she said before they could even speak. "These are the only snacks approved for your section." Harold looked down at the bag of pretzels like it had just dropped from another planet. "This is Comfort Select, isn't it?" he asked evenly. According to the airline website, snacks and beverage service mirror first class. Lindsay didn't blink. "Company policy evolves constantly," she said, her tone clipped. "I suggest writing to customer service if you have concerns." With that, she turned on her heel and strode back to the galley, her smirk growing with every step. What she didn't notice was the way other passengers had begun to watch. A young woman in 3C had paused her audiobook. A businessman in 5A pretended to scroll his phone, but hadn't turned a page in several minutes. They were witnessing something, even if they weren't ready to name it. Lindsay continued her performance, occasionally glancing toward Ruth and Harold, looking for signs of resistance. Instead, she saw Ruth take a deep breath and reach into her purse, pulling out a leather-bound journal. She flipped it open and began to write. Not angrily, not frantically, just steadily, like she was documenting a process. That made Lindsay pause. People who write things down don't forget. People who write things down take action. As dinner service began, Lindsay escalated again. She approached their row with a cart, but this time she brought no menus. "We're only offering the vegetarian entree back here," she said quickly, not meeting their eyes. Ruth raised her eyebrows slightly. "No choice?" she asked. Lindsay stiffened. "No, ma'am." Again, due to weight and catering limits. "I see," Ruth said, and glanced to Harold, who nodded. "We'll take it then." The tray she placed in front of them was lukewarm and visibly less portioned than those served up front. Plastic cutlery instead of silver, paper napkin instead of cloth. Lindsay lingered just long enough to enjoy the contrast, then returned to her more favored passengers. And yet, for all her efforts, she couldn't shake the growing discomfort in her chest. Something about the way Ruth kept writing. Something about the way Harold occasionally looked at the name tag pinned to her blouse. There was no visible anger in them, and that was unnerving, because Lindsay had learned over the years that quiet people, especially the ones with dignity, could be dangerous. They didn't shout. They didn't argue. They remembered, and they waited. Behind her, a junior attendant named Heather hesitated before stepping into the galley. She had noticed what Lindsay had been doing. Everyone had. Heather had trained under Lindsay and admired her once. But today, something felt wrong. Should we be cutting them off from full service? Heather asked quietly. Lindsay turned, her voice icy. "Heather, you're new, so let me explain something. Passengers can complain all they want. But the ones who don't fit the culture of this cabin, they ruin the experience for everyone else. We're not just serving food. We're curating an environment. Understand?" The tension Lindsay Monroe had carefully layered into every interaction with Harold and Ruth Simmons hadn't diminished with time. It had matured like rot beneath the surface. Every calculated slight, every withheld amenity, had been delivered with a veil of professionalism so thin it couldn't hide the contempt underneath. And yet, neither Harold nor Ruth had raised their voices, lodged a complaint, or broken decorum. That irritated Lindsay more than if they had. It was their restraint, their quiet dignity, that mocked her authority. So, when the opportunity to escalate beyond passive aggression arose, Lindsay didn't hesitate. She was clearing the first-class cabin of empty glasses when she overheard a conversation between two passengers in row 1C and 1D. They were discussing the university system, tenure, endowments, academic grants. Lindsay paused just long enough to pick up on something useful. One of them asked the other, "You remember Harold Simmons, the economist who wrote that federal restructuring theory?" The other chuckled. "Yeah, guy's a legend. He's on every board from New York to Chicago." Lindsay's jaw tightened. That Harold Simmons? She looked over her shoulder, back toward row 4. Could it be? She tapped the cart handle slowly. If it was true, then she had spent the last 2 hours trying to humiliate someone who probably had more honorary doctorates than she had promotions. But instead of adjusting her behavior, Lindsay's mind twisted the new information into fuel. This wasn't just about a misplaced couple anymore. It was about cutting someone down to size. The fact that he was someone made it worse for her, not better. Lindsay resumed her service with forced calm and returned to Harold and Ruth under the guise of checking on their comfort. "I heard you used to teach," she said casually, leaning close enough to seem friendly, but keeping her voice loud enough for nearby rows to hear. Harold looked up, guarded. "Still do, in a limited capacity," he replied. "Lectures mostly." "Oh," Lindsay said with theatrical curiosity. "At a community college?" Her voice dripped with saccharine innocence, as if the implication were accidental. Harold's eyes didn't flinch, but his mouth formed a quiet smile. "Not quite. University of Chicago. Occasionally Harvard, when I feel like traveling." Ruth didn't look up. She continued writing in her notebook, but her pen paused for a moment, and Lindsay noticed. She forced a chuckle. "Impressive," she said, her lips twitching. "So you're, a consultant now? Or one of those retired types who can't quite let go?" Her words had the casual cruelty of someone trying to cut without seeming like they'd drawn a knife. Harold met her gaze evenly. "I've never believed that learning has a retirement age." His tone was polite, but there was a warning buried in the cadence. Ruth looked up then, not with hostility, but with something far more unsettling: precision. "And what is it that you do exactly?" she asked Lindsay, her voice smooth. "Aside from serving sparkling water and offering commentary on professions you clearly don't understand." Lindsay's jaw tensed. "I manage premium passenger experiences," she said, emphasizing each word as if it carried military weight. "I uphold standards." Ruth nodded slowly. "So you determine which passengers are worthy of service based on personal instinct?" "Of course not," Lindsay said quickly, too quickly. "I follow protocol." Harold leaned forward slightly. "And what protocol is that, Miss Monroe?" "The one where champagne is served only to passengers who don't threaten your worldview." Lindsay's nostrils flared. "Sir, with respect." "No," Ruth interrupted. "Don't call him sir if you can't treat him like one." Her voice was still calm, but it had the edge of someone who had spent decades fighting polite disrespect and wasn't in the mood to let it slide this time. The exchange had drawn more attention than Lindsay realized. Several passengers had stopped mid-conversation. One man across the aisle removed his earbuds. A woman with a laptop subtly hit record on her phone. Sensing the loss of control, Lindsay straightened and stepped back, her hands tightening behind her back. "I think it's best we all focus on the flight," she said curtly, then turned and walked quickly toward the galley. Her cheeks flushed not with embarrassment, but with resentment. In the galley, she paced. The nerve of them, challenging her, undermining her in front of other passengers. Who did they think they were? Academics, retired, past their prime, out of touch. And yet they had dismantled her control with a few quiet sentences and a steady tone. Lindsay fumed, then grabbed the service phone and called down to the flight manager. "I'm flagging an issue in row 4, she said, her voice low. "The couple is becoming confrontational, disruptive." She didn't wait for a response before hanging up. If they wanted to test her, they'd learn just how much authority she still held. Back in their row, Harold sighed quietly and returned to reading. Ruth, meanwhile, resumed her note-taking. Only now she added dates, names, and direct quotes. The exchange with Harold and Ruth Simmons had shaken something loose, not guilt or doubt, but rage. They had embarrassed her, not by yelling or accusing her of racism, which would have been easier to swat down with policy jargon and fake apologies. No, they'd embarrassed her by staying composed, by answering with wit and clarity, by holding up a mirror to her behavior and letting everyone else on the plane see what kind of person she really was. And now, Lindsay was determined to reassert herself. Not subtly, not quietly. This time, she would do it in full view of every passenger on the aircraft. As she stepped out of the galley, her eyes swept the cabin, then zeroed in on the intercom handset mounted on the wall by the service station. She picked it up without hesitation and pressed the cabin-wide button, her voice cool and clipped as it crackled through the speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are just finalizing a brief seating clarification before takeoff. We appreciate your patience as we address a minor ticketing discrepancy." Her words were calculated neutral on the surface, but designed to suggest incompetence or error on the part of the passengers involved. She didn't say names, but she didn't need to. Everyone already knew who she was talking about. Row 4D and 4E. The couple who had been moved. The couple who spoke too eloquently to be ignored. A soft murmur spread across the cabin like a ripple in still water. Lindsay hung up the handset, her eyes scanning the faces around her. Some passengers frowned, others exchanged glances. A few looked at Harold and Ruth with pity, a few with judgment. Lindsay liked the confusion. It sowed doubt, made people second-guess what they'd seen. That's how power works, she thought. Not through facts, but through perception. Moments later, she approached Ruth with a faux apologetic smile stretched tight across her face. "Mrs. Simmons," she said, her tone louder than necessary, "would you mind stepping into the aisle for a moment?" Ruth looked up, puzzled but composed. "Why?" she asked. Lindsay didn't answer directly. "There's something I need to confirm with your luggage," she said. already reaching down toward Ruth's carry-on beneath the seat. Harold placed a hand gently on the handle before she could pull it free. "There's nothing in there you need," he said firmly. "We packed light. No checked bags. Everything we brought is within regulation." Lindsay forced a small laugh. "Of course," she said, "but I'll just need to double-check the weight and security compliance." Without waiting for consent, she tugged the bag into the aisle and unzipped it. A hush fell over the surrounding rows as she pulled out a folded cardigan, a book of crossword puzzles, a travel-sized toiletry bag, and finally, Ruth's small, zippered clutch. "Is this yours?" Lindsay asked, holding it up. Ruth's voice was steel. "Yes. And unless you're about to confess to losing your job and becoming TSA, you have no right to open it." A gasp from somewhere nearby was followed by the sound of someone recording on their phone. Lindsay hesitated for half a second, then smiled as if the entire exchange was a game. She returned the items to the bag with careless speed, zipping it with a tug that nearly broke the seam, and shoved it under the seat. As she stood, she turned toward Harold, her next target. "And sir," she said, still projecting her voice just enough, "about your cane." He looked up slowly. "What about it?" Lindsay placed her hands on her hips. "It's technically an assistive device. We're required to confirm it's non-electronic and free of tampering." "Tampering?" Harold echoed, narrowing his eyes. "It's a piece of carved oak with a rubber foot. Are you suggesting I built a weapon inside it?" "Of course not," Lindsay replied, "but protocol requires I check." "Then call your captain," Harold said quietly, "because the next thing you put your hands on will be a legal complaint." The statement didn't come with fire or fury, just certainty. And yet, Lindsay didn't back down. She couldn't. Her pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, she looked around as if appealing to the other passengers for support. "I'm just trying to keep everyone safe," she said, projecting faux sincerity. "Even when some passengers forget that this is a shared space, not a private library or academic office." Ruth sat straighter, her expression still calm. "And you seem to forget that working in the sky doesn't make you any less grounded in common decency." The line hit like a slap. Audible murmurs broke out across the cabin. Someone coughed and muttered, "She's out of line." Lindsay stepped back, her hands trembling just slightly now, though she masked it with a forced smile. "I'll bring your meal soon," she said, before turning quickly toward the galley. She didn't look back this time. She didn't want to see the growing number of people watching her with narrowed eyes. Watching not just because of what she had done, but because of what she might do next. Behind her, Harold and Ruth exchanged a silent glance. There was no triumph in their expressions, only weariness. Passengers had begun to murmur openly, whispering just loud enough for her to catch fragments like unprofessional and disrespectful, but not loud enough to face direct consequences. And though Lindsay had perfected the art of disregarding disapproval, this time it grated at her nerves because she knew it wasn't just whispers, it was evidence building. She had let herself slip. Her disdain for Harold and Ruth Simmons had grown so personal, so obsessive, that it now hovered in the air like smoke. She needed to shift the narrative. She needed to legitimize her behavior, not just for those watching, but for herself. So she crafted a new story, one that would cast her not as the aggressor, but as the vigilant professional enforcing misunderstood company policy. First, she accessed the flight's internal service tablet, a tool designed to log passenger behavior, service history, and escalation records. Most attendants used it to track allergies and upgrades. Lindsay used it to rewrite context. She created a log entry for row 4D and 4E, passengers exhibiting inconsistent behavior, possible ticketing conflict flagged pre-departure, observed resistance to safety verification of carry-on items and cane, proceeding with caution. It was a digital shield, something she could point to later if her decisions were questioned. Her fingers paused briefly over the screen before she added, "Suggested reassignment pending captain's discretion." Once submitted, the log would auto-sync to the airline's in-flight operations hub. No supervisor would question it immediately. After all, it came from a veteran. It wouldn't take effect now mid-air, but it laid the groundwork. Next, Lindsay crafted the scene. She returned to the aisle with a second attendant, Heather, still quiet, still uneasy from earlier, and whispered just loud enough for Ruth and Harold to hear, "I've contacted management regarding seat classification. There appears to be a deeper eligibility issue tied to the booking class used for these tickets." Ruth looked up, her eyes steady. "What are you implying now?" Lindsay clasped her hands together in faux sympathy. "Nothing personal, of course. But certain corporate discounted fares don't always qualify for sustained first-class placement. We've had guests accidentally booked into cabins above their classification tier before. It causes confusion all the time." Harold set down his book slowly. "We purchased these tickets directly. No discount, no voucher, and no confusion until you created one." Lindsay leaned slightly closer, her voice syrupy. "We understand you may believe that, but the system doesn't lie, and it's flagging something unusual." Nearby passengers had grown quiet again, pretending not to listen, but clearly absorbing every word. Lindsay turned to Heather and gestured discreetly. "Please bring me the manual reclassification sheet." Heather hesitated. "Manual? Just do it," Lindsay whispered, sharper this time. Heather walked off. Lindsay, now alone with them again, smiled with a predator's patience. "We do appreciate your understanding," she said, as though nothing had happened. Ruth said nothing, but her silence was ice. Harold didn't blink. "You're going to extraordinary lengths to justify something that was never broken," he said. "That's usually what happens when people are afraid of being proven wrong." Before Lindsay could reply, a small notification dinged on her tablet. It was a message from the cabin purser. "Received your flag. Be advised, no reassignments authorized without captain's notice. Sit tight." She clenched her jaw. Not a no, but not the yes she needed. Still, she wasn't done. Heather returned moments later with the manual seating form, blank and pristine. Lindsay filled it out quickly, writing pending verification, under reason for adjustment, then tucked it into her clipboard like a smoking gun she hadn't fired yet. To the casual observer, it looked official. To passengers unsure of what was happening, it might even look justified. It was the illusion of structure, a trick Lindsay had mastered long ago. Wrap your bias in procedure and call it protocol. She resumed her aisle rounds, but this time she whispered small things into passengers' ears as she passed, just an unfortunate mix-up. They were never meant to be there. Corporate-level issue with their fare, I believe. We're trying to avoid embarrassing anyone too much. Not everyone believed her, but enough nodded awkwardly or looked away, unsure of what to do with the information. Lindsay wasn't after belief, just doubt. If she could plant enough of it, she could reclaim the authority she'd lost. But what she didn't realize was that her voice had carried farther than intended. A man 2 rows ahead, early 40s, blazer, sharp jawline, had caught every word. He hadn't said a thing, hadn't even looked back. But now, quietly, he pulled out his phone and began typing a note. Another passenger, a woman in business attire, had started recording without aiming her camera directly, capturing Lindsay's comments over footage of the cabin. The reclassification sheet completed. The subtle whispers seeded among passengers. All that remained was to deliver the final blow, one that would not just remove Harold and Ruth Simmons from first class socially and symbolically, but publicly and irreparably. She knew from experience that some passengers wouldn't speak up, even when something was obviously wrong. Most people avoided confrontation in the air. All she had to do now was push just a little harder, humiliate just a little deeper, and she could crush whatever quiet resistance Harold and Ruth had left. Because as long as they stayed silent, she believed they stayed powerless. She returned to their row with a look of artificial urgency stitched onto her face. Her voice rose just enough to catch attention from the front few rows. "Mr. and Mrs. Simmons," she said, holding the clipboard in hand as if it were a legal document, "I've received final confirmation from operations. You were placed in this section in error. I'm going to ask you to prepare to relocate your belongings. Another party will be seated here shortly." Ruth looked up slowly, her pen still in hand. "You've already moved us once," she said. "And now again?" Lindsay nodded stiffly. I've done my best to delay the process, but we can't hold these seats any longer. You'll be reassigned to seats 22F and 22G. The words hit like a slap. Not just economy, but back row economy, beside the lavatory in the no recline zone near the galley noise. Ruth exhaled softly, not in defeat, but in warning. You are not just moving us, she said. You are attempting to erase us. Lindsay smiled tightly, ignoring the weight of the statement. I'm just enforcing the system, ma'am. Nothing personal. Heather, watching from a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably, her face tight with anxiety. She wanted to speak up, but didn't. Lindsay, emboldened by the silence, turned to Harold. Sir, if you could stand now. We need to prepare for the incoming guests. Harold closed his book with a deliberate motion, then stood, slowly, calmly, with the gravity of someone used to standing before entire lecture halls of future world leaders. And who are these guests, he asked. Lindsay's lips curled. There are platinum-tier clients, frequent flyers, high value. They actually qualify for this level of service. Harold tilted his head. And how do you qualify value, MS? Monroe? Miles flown or dollars earned? Lindsay didn't flinch. Consistency, loyalty, not entitlement. The words hung in the air, sharper than she realized. Ruth stood now too, her frame still graceful. You've made up your mind about us from the moment we boarded, she said. And now you're rewriting reality to match your bias. Lindsay scoffed. You're overreacting. If anything, I've gone out of my way to avoid making this uncomfortable. No, Harold said, his voice lower now, but steadier than ever. You've gone out of your way to make this a performance. Lindsay's expression hardened. I'll have to call airport security on arrival if you don't comply, she said, louder now, looking around as if seeking backup from other passengers. Please don't escalate this. The irony of her own words didn't register. At that moment, a young man in row 3 lowered his phone from his lap and spoke clearly enough for several rows to hear. Ma'am, I've been recording everything since you started threatening them. His voice was calm, unwavering. And if you think this is going to look good on the internet, think again. Lindsay turned to him sharply. Sir, you're not authorized to film in the cabin. Neither are you authorized to lie to people in front of 30 witnesses. The man shot back. More heads turned. A woman in 2A leaned into the aisle, her face pale. I don't know what's happening, she said, but this doesn't feel right. A couple in business class peered between the curtain. An older man with a soft German accent muttered. They paid for their seats. Let them sit in peace. Lindsay's grip on the clipboard tightened. Her authority was unraveling and fast. She needed one more jab, something final, something public. So she smiled and leaned closer to Ruth. Look, I understand you may have been something once, she whispered, just loud enough for nearby rows to catch. But that doesn't mean the world still owes you respect. Ruth didn't blink. She simply said, no, but you owe it to yourself not to become the villain in someone else's story. Lindsay straightened, face flushing for the first time. Her voice caught in her throat, and she turned, retreating quickly back toward the galley, as a wave of quiet disapproval followed her. Behind her, Harold and Ruth remained standing, not because they had surrendered, but because they had chosen not to sit in a space that no longer deserved their presence. She tapped frantically on her tablet, scrolling through the cabin manifest again, looking for some data point, any excuse to justify further action. But there was nothing. The Simmons booking was flawless. No flag codes, no red tier fare anomalies, no internal notes. Full price purchase, early booking, assigned seats, and now witnesses. She backed out of the manifest screen and pulled up the comms module, typing a coded message to ground support, requesting cabin authority override, possible fraudulent boarding. Security team needed on arrival. Suspected escalation risk, row 4. The wording was vague but heavy, enough to trigger response protocol without triggering suspicion of her own intent. Once sent, it was out of her hands, and that's what she needed, a fallback. Outside the galley curtain, the cabin was growing tenser. Ruth and Harold remained standing in the aisle, calm but unyielding. They had refused the reassigned seats. They hadn't sat back down, but they hadn't disrupted the flight either. A young male attendant approached them quietly, offering water. Ruth accepted it with a nod, and the young man, glancing nervously toward the galley, said softly, "If there's anything I can do," before backing away. They didn't ask for help. They didn't need to. Their stillness said enough. Lindsay pulled the curtain aside and stepped back into the aisle with a forced smile stitched across her lips. "Just to be clear," she announced, directing her voice to the front rows under the guise of reassurance, "we are following official procedure regarding a seating discrepancy. No one is being targeted, and no inappropriate conduct is taking place." Her gaze landed briefly on the phone held up by the man in row 3, still recording, his eyebrow raised in dry disbelief. She added quickly, "Any recordings made during flight without consent may violate federal privacy laws and airline policy." Harold looked toward her, then toward the man with the phone. "Let it record," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Let it all record. The truth doesn't need a permission slip." That single sentence sent another pulse through the cabin. A middle-aged woman near the bulkhead clapped once, just once, but it broke the silence enough to cause heads to turn. Lindsay's mouth opened, then shut. The power dynamic was shifting faster than she could contain. At that moment, Heather, pale and tense, pulled Lindsay aside near the galley door. Her voice was low but urgent. "Lindsay, you need to stop." Lindsay blinked, startled by the directness. "Excuse me." "This is going too far," Heather said. "You're escalating something that didn't need to happen. They didn't do anything wrong, and now the whole cabin is watching." Lindsay straightened. "You don't understand how this works. If we lose control, we lose order. If we let one exception, this isn't about policy anymore," Heather interrupted. "It's about you. You're not enforcing anything. You're retaliating." Lindsay's face stiffened. She turned away without responding, and Heather, for the first time in her career, felt the deep urge to file her own report. But before she could act, the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice, calm and clipped, addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received a communication from the cabin crew regarding a security concern involving 2 passengers. Please remain seated as we coordinate with ground personnel. Thank you." Gasps spread like a shockwave. Lindsay's plan had worked. The coded message had triggered response. Security would meet the plane on the tarmac. But the triumph was short-lived. Ruth turned to Harold, touched his arm gently, and whispered something. He nodded once, then calmly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim, black phone. He tapped the screen 3 times. The passengers near him leaned in, curious. Within seconds, a low chime sounded from the speakers. Then a voice unfamiliar to Lindsay echoed from the first-class audio feed. "This is Adrian Mercer, Director of Aviation Relations for Meridian Air. We have been notified of a serious breach in conduct aboard Flight 912. Effective immediately. All crew decisions regarding passengers Harold and Ruth Simmons are suspended pending executive review. Do not attempt further reassignment. Ground personnel will be conducting inquiry upon arrival." Lindsay's stomach dropped. She turned toward the cockpit in disbelief, but the captain didn't respond. The voice hadn't come from him. It had come from above him. Ruth Simmons sat down slowly, her expression unchanged, composed as ever. She gently closed her notebook, then folded her hands on top of it, her back straight, her presence commanding without effort. Harold remained standing for a moment longer, adjusting his blazer with deliberate care, before finally returning to his seat beside his wife. He didn't look at Lindsay. He didn't have to. She felt the shift, the weight of authority, the perception of control. It had moved, and not in her favor. Heather stepped beside her, eyes wide but steady. "What was that?" she whispered. Lindsay couldn't respond. Her lips moved slightly, but no words came. She tried to summon a dismissive explanation, something about system hacks or technical errors. But the truth was, she had never heard that name before. Adrian Mercer, Director of Aviation Relations. That wasn't a mid-level supervisor or someone buried in corporate. That was executive level. That was someone who didn't just oversee policy, they wrote it. And he had just overridden her. Meanwhile, in the front of the cabin, The man who had been recording lowered his phone and leaned into the aisle. "You still want to pretend this is about policy?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with contempt. Lindsay ignored him. She turned toward Harold and Ruth, forcing herself to speak. "What is this? Who exactly are you people?" The moment the question left her mouth, she regretted it. Not because of how it sounded, but because of the answer she sensed was coming. Harold looked up at her, slowly, his gaze piercing. "You've spent the entire flight trying to diminish us," he said. "And now you want us to explain ourselves?" Ruth placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "No, darling," she said softly. "Let her learn the way she's forced others to learn, publicly." She reached into her bag and retrieved a slender black leather folder. She opened it with quiet grace and slid out a single document, holding it just high enough for Lindsay and anyone else nearby to see. At the top, in crisp serif lettering, was the seal of Meridian Air's Board of Directors. Beneath it, Dr. Ruth Simmons, Executive Advisory Chair, Ethics and Equity Oversight Committee. Dr. Harold Simmons, Founding Partner, Global Aviation Policy Review Council. Gasps spread in synchronized waves through the cabin. Lindsay felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, not from turbulence, but from the realization that the people she had tried to dehumanize were, in fact, part of the very system that governed her job. Not only that, they were architects of the standards she had weaponized. You're on the board," she stammered. "No," Ruth said plainly. "We helped build the board." Heather's hand flew to her mouth. The man in 3A whistled under his breath. "She tried to remove the people who write her paychecks," he muttered. Another passenger added, "That's not just irony. That's career suicide." Lindsay's voice cracked. "No one told me," she said, as if ignorance were a shield. Harold stood again, his posture flawless, his voice low and surgical. "You didn't need to be told. You didn't ask. You assumed." He gestured to the cabin. "Not just about our status, but our humanity. And now you've discovered that dignity doesn't require credentials, but power sometimes does." Ruth turned slightly in her seat, addressing not just Lindsay, but the entire row of passengers. "Let me be clear," she said. "This isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. For years, we've fought to make this airline more inclusive, more accountable. And today, we saw the rot that remains. You didn't just violate policy, Ms. Monroe. You violated purpose." Lindsay's face drained of color. Her mouth opened again, but before she could respond, the intercom chimed once more. This time, it was the captain's voice, tighter than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed that 2 passengers on board are senior oversight officials with Meridian's Ethics Division. As per executive protocol, we are suspending all internal disciplinary actions until further review by company leadership. We appreciate your cooperation." Lindsay stumbled backward slightly, her clipboard slipping from her hands and clattering to the floor. She reached for the curtain, but Heather stopped her gently. "Don't," she said quietly. "Everyone's seen enough." The passengers watched her not with curiosity, but with sharpened awareness. The truth had landed harder than any turbulence ever could. The people she tried to humiliate were not just passengers. They were power in its quietest and most undeniable form. Harold Simmons, still standing, turned slightly and addressed the captain directly through the open cockpit door, his voice carrying just enough weight to demand a response without ever raising in volume. "Captain, I want to make it very clear. We are not requesting special treatment. We are requesting the restoration of decency, not just for us, but for every passenger that may walk onto this aircraft believing they have to prove their worth before they're allowed to be respected." The captain, visible only from the shoulders up, gave a small nod that rippled through the cabin like an apology, without words. Heather, still rooted near the service station, couldn't meet Ruth's eyes. She had watched the unraveling from the inside, every micro-decision, every tone shift, every manipulation Lindsay had orchestrated. And she hadn't spoken up, not when she first noticed, not when Ruth's bag was searched without reason, not when Lindsay broadcast her humiliations over the intercom. But now, guilt pressed down harder than protocol. She stepped forward cautiously. "Dr. Simmons," she began, her voice tentative. I just "I'm sorry. I should have stopped it sooner." Ruth didn't scold her. She simply nodded, her eyes soft but steady. "Not stopping injustice doesn't make you cruel," she said. "But it doesn't make you innocent either." Lindsay finally broke her stillness, stepping forward with a forced sense of purpose, though her confidence now looked like the echo of someone else's authority. "This situation has gotten out of hand," she said to the cabin, her voice brittle, cracking under the pressure. "We all have a job to do. I followed policy. I followed protocol." Harold looked at her, not with anger, but with something colder, clarity. "No," he said, "you followed preference. You followed prejudice, dressed in the uniform of procedure. That's not policy. That's personal." Lindsay opened her mouth to respond, but at that exact moment, a notification pinged on her tablet, the sound unusually loud in the heavy silence. She picked it up automatically, scanning the screen, and froze. The message came from Meridian HQ, with the subject line, "Urgent immediate termination, proceedings initiated crew, L. Monroe." Her breath caught. She tapped into the internal network, heart pounding, and saw the full note. "Crew member Lindsay Monroe is hereby suspended effective immediately pending formal termination. Removed from service roster upon landing. Ground protocol team will escort. No further duties to be performed." The room spun slightly. Her mind tried to rationalize it, to find a loophole, to believe this was just a misunderstanding. But there it was, in black and white, from a name she couldn't contest. Adria Mercer. She backed up a step, almost stumbling into the service cart. Heather instinctively moved to steady her, but then hesitated, letting her hands drop. Lindsay looked around, desperate for an ally. None of the passengers met her eyes. Then Ruth stood again, slowly, purposefully. "You thought today was about power," she said, "but it never was. It was about character. And yours collapsed the moment you were asked to treat someone with none." Lindsay's lips parted as if to reply, but no words followed. Her throat tightened, her pride curdling into something bitter and cold. She realized then that the most humiliating part wasn't being fired. It was being fired by the people she'd decided weren't worthy of basic kindness. She had called for security. She had drafted disciplinary reports. She had tried to orchestrate removal. And now, she was the one being removed. Not just from the plane, but from the illusion that she was untouchable. The plane descended slowly through a veil of golden clouds as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a warm glow across the cabin that stood in stark contrast to the chill wrapped around Lindsay Monroe's shoulders. She remained near the galley, frozen in place, no longer issuing orders, no longer pretending to serve. She wasn't a crew member anymore, just a passenger awaiting consequences. Her badge hung limp from her pocket, useless, stripped of authority, a relic of a persona that no longer existed. No one looked at her with sympathy. Not the passengers she'd once dismissed. Not her colleagues. Not even Heather, who now moved through the cabin, assisting Ruth and Harold with calm, reverent grace. When the landing gear thudded beneath them and the aircraft began its final approach, Lindsay's fingers trembled, not from fear of flying, but from the inevitability of her fall. Just hours ago, she had been the one in control, the gatekeeper, the enforcer. Now, she was the subject of scandal, a name that would be whispered in training modules under the heading, "What Not to Do." As the plane touched down and rolled to a smooth stop at the gate, the captain's voice returned, formal, composed, unmistakably measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we complete taxiing. A ground operations team will be boarding the aircraft for a matter requiring immediate crew coordination. We thank you for your patience and cooperation." The tension in the cabin shifted again, but this time it wasn't confusion, it was anticipation. Everyone knew who they were here for. Lindsay tried to breathe evenly, but the dread pooled deep and cold inside her chest. She glanced toward the door just in time to see 3 uniformed personnel step into the jet bridge, their presence unmistakable even before the door hissed open. One carried a tablet. One wore a Meridian badge. The third, a security liaison, didn't smile. They boarded silently and spoke first to the captain, who simply nodded and gestured toward the rear of the cabin where Lindsay now stood, waiting not out of respect, but because she had nowhere else to go. The lead agent addressed her in a tone devoid of judgment, but firm as stone. Ms. Monroe, you are hereby relieved of all active duties pending termination review. Your conduct has triggered a Level 3 ethics breach under executive oversight. Please gather your belongings. You will be escorted from the aircraft immediately. Lindsay didn't speak. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She picked up her clipboard, her service tablet, and her bag, though they felt like props in a play she'd already been cut from. She turned, walking past rows of passengers who no longer feared her gaze. Some looked away. Others didn't bother. One man even tilted his phone slightly to capture the moment, the same way someone might photograph the end of a long, grim performance. But as she neared row 4, she hesitated. Ruth and Harold were still seated, quiet, dignified, unshaken. Lindsay stopped, perhaps hoping for one final chance to rewrite the ending, to offer a look of regret, a word of apology. But Harold didn't meet her eyes. Ruth did. And what Lindsay saw there wasn't anger. It was something far worse. Disappointment. Ruth simply said, in a tone that cut through the silence like truth through pride, "There's a difference between power and decency. You had one. You threw away the other." Lindsay swallowed hard, then kept walking, her exit silent but complete. When she passed through the doorway and disappeared into the terminal, a hush settled over the aircraft, as if the entire cabin had collectively exhaled. Moments later, an assistant from Meridian's executive team entered the cabin and approached Harold and Ruth. She handed them 2 envelopes, each embossed with the airline's crest. "On behalf of our board," she said respectfully, "please accept our formal apology and this gesture of restitution. The CEO will reach out personally. We're also initiating a full review of onboard conduct policies effective immediately, starting with bias response training across all staff levels." Ruth nodded once, accepting the letter. Harold didn't take his eyes off the window. He wasn't basking in victory. He was remembering every time someone like Lindsay had acted the same way and gotten away with it. The passengers began to disembark. One by one, they passed Harold and Ruth, some offering small gestures, a hand to the shoulder, a whispered thank you, a respectful nod. The man with the recording phone paused, smiled, and simply said, "You changed something today." Ruth returned the smile, not with pride, but with quiet knowing. When they finally stood and walked down the aisle, it wasn't a march of the vindicated. It was a procession of those who never needed revenge to feel whole. Justice, it turned out, didn't always roar. Sometimes it moved in silence. But when it arrived, it left nothing untouched. Outside, the golden hour bathed the terminal in light. Lindsay Monroe stood off to the side, surrounded by corporate personnel, her future unraveling in real time. Ruth and Harold walked past her without a glance, their posture unshaken, their legacy intact. No bitterness, no gloating, just 2 people who had endured enough to know that dignity was never something others gave you. It was something you kept, even when the world tried to take it. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss more powerful stories like this. Where in the world are you watching from? And what moment in this story hit you the hardest? Was it the reveal of their true identities, the final escort off the plane, or something in between? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. Let's talk about dignity, justice, and what real accountability looks like.